An 18-year-old girl is brutally murdered, and instead of justice, the case goes quiet. No arrests, no urgency, just silence. But behind that silence was one man with enough power to bend the system in just 3 days, Bumpy Johnson. Before we get into this, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps build this community. And if you value true crime stories that are deeply researched, responsibly told, and based on real historical records, make sure you subscribe. A lot of time and effort goes into verifying details, cross-checking sources, and separating myth from fact so you get the most accurate story possible. Ruby Williams was just 18 years old, standing at that fragile point between childhood and adulthood where life feels like it's finally opening up. She wasn't a public figure, not a criminal, not someone living on the edges of society. She was a young woman with plans, relationships, and a future that had barely begun, in a neighborhood where survival often demanded toughness beyond your years. Ruby was still finding her footing, which made what happened to her all the more devastating. At 18, Ruby legally occupied a strange middle ground. Old enough to be treated as an adult by the system, young enough to still be deeply vulnerable. That age mattered because it stripped away any easy excuses. This wasn't a hardened criminal or someone known to police. This was a teenager, someone society is supposed to protect. Her age alone should have triggered urgency, outrage, and relentless investigation, but it didn't. People who knew Ruby described her as someone trying to live a normal life despite the pressure of her surroundings. Harlem at the time was not an easy place for young people, especially young women. Opportunities were limited, danger was close, and choices were often shaped by forces far bigger than you. Ruby wasn't powerful, wealthy, or connected, and that lack of protection would ultimately matter more than anyone realized. Her youth also meant she was easy to silence in the public narrative. With no long record, no loud advocates, no powerful family backing her, Ruby became another name at risk of being lost to time. In communities dominated by fear and hierarchy, the lives of young people, especially young women, were often treated as disposable when they disrupted the status quo. What made Ruby's age especially significant was how it contrasted with the response to her death. When an 18-year-old is murdered, the expectation is immediate action. Instead, there was hesitation, delays, a noticeable lack of urgency. Disconnect raised quiet questions among locals almost immediately. Why wasn't this being treated like the emergency it was? For many in Harlem, Ruby represented countless young people caught between innocence and exposure. Her death wasn't just about one life lost. It was about what her loss signaled. If someone so young could be killed and seemingly forgotten, what did that say about whose lives truly mattered in that system? And that's why Ruby Williams' age is impossible to separate from the story. She wasn't just a victim. She was a symbol of vulnerability in a place where power decided everything. Her youth should have protected her. Instead, it made her easier to overlook, and that uncomfortable truth sits at the heart of this entire case. The circumstances surrounding Ruby Williams' murder were murky from the very beginning, and that uncertainty became part of the story itself. What was known early on was painfully simple. Ruby was found dead under violent circumstances, and the people closest to the scene understood immediately that this was no accident. Yet details that would normally be made public, timelines, suspects, clear explanations were slow to emerge or never fully surfaced at all. Accounts from the neighborhood suggested that Ruby had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught in a situation far larger than herself. Some said she may have witnessed something she wasn't meant to see, while others believed she was connected, even loosely, to someone involved in Harlem's criminal underworld. None of these possibilities were ever clearly confirmed, but the rumors alone were enough to create fear and silence among potential witnesses. What stood out most was how quickly the narrative stalled. In cases like this, investigators usually push hard in the first hours, canvassing the area, questioning associates, pressing for information. With Ruby's case, that momentum never seemed to fully build. People noticed officers asking fewer questions than expected, returning calls late or not at all. It was subtle, but it was noticed. Neighbors reportedly spoke in hushed tones, not because they didn't care, but because they were afraid. Harlem at the time operated under an unspoken rule: some truths came with consequences. Even those who may have known something were careful about what they said and to whom. Fear didn't just surround the crime, it shaped the response to it. Another troubling aspect was the lack of a clear suspect early on. Whether due to missing evidence, uncooperative witnesses, or outside pressure, the case never developed the kind of focus that leads to accountability. Instead, it drifted, as if no one wanted to pull too hard on the threads that might unravel something bigger. For Ruby's family and those who cared about her, the circumstances felt deliberately obscured. Every unanswered question became its own wound. How did this happen? Who was responsible? And why did it feel like the system wasn't pushing for answers with the urgency her life deserved? In the end, the circumstances of Ruby Williams' murder became defined as much by what was missing as by what was known. A young woman was killed, and instead of clarity, the case filled with silence, rumors, and fear. That fog would only grow thicker in the days that followed, especially once powerful forces began moving behind the scenes. The initial police response to Ruby Williams' murder was, at best, restrained and at worst, deeply troubling. In the hours after her death, there was an expectation among locals that the area would be flooded with officers, detectives, and questions. Instead, the response felt muted. There was activity, yes, but not the kind that signals urgency or determination. People noticed the difference almost immediately. Officers arrived, secured the scene, and went through the motions required on paper. But what was missing was intensity. There were no aggressive canvases that stretched late into the night. No visible pressure on people who might have known something. The investigation appeared procedural rather than passionate, as if this was a case to be managed, not solved. Residents of the neighborhood paid close attention to these details because they knew what a real police response looked like. When high-profile victims or politically sensitive cases occurred, the energy was unmistakable. With Ruby, that energy never fully arrived. The contrast was impossible to ignore, especially given her age and the violent nature of the crime. Some witnesses, later claimed they were briefly questioned, only to never hear back again. Follow-ups were inconsistent. Tips seemed to vanish into a void. This inconsistency sent a quiet but powerful message. Whatever happened to Ruby was not going to be pursued with the full weight of the law. There was also an apparent lack of communication. Families in these situations often receive updates, reassurances, or at least a sense that progress is being made. Ruby's loved ones were met with long stretches of silence. Calls went unanswered. Promises of updates faded. Absence of transparency only deepened suspicions. As days passed, the tone shifted from concern to resignation. Officers who initially appeared cautious became distant. The sense that the case was cooling, not because it lacked importance, but because it was becoming inconvenient, began to take hold in the community. Early police response set the stage for everything that followed. It wasn't dramatic enough to cause outrage on its own. It was subtle, controlled, and revealing. And in hindsight, many believe it was the first sign that forces beyond the crime itself were already influencing how far the investigation would be allowed to go. Harlem during Bumpy Johnson's reign was a place of sharp contrasts, vibrant culture, and deep fear existing side by side. Music, community, and resilience filled the streets, but so did an unspoken understanding that power operated behind the scenes. People knew who really controlled the neighborhood, and that knowledge shaped how they lived, spoke, and survived. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a name, he was a presence. His influence reached far beyond illegal activity and into everyday life. Shop owners, residents, and even local figures understood that certain lines could not be crossed. He was seen by some as a protector of Harlem, someone who kept outside forces at bay, while others viewed him as a reminder that authority didn't always wear a badge. There was a strict code in place, and most people followed it without question. You didn't talk to police unless you absolutely had to. You didn't ask too many questions, and you certainly didn't involve yourself in matters that could draw the attention of powerful people. Silence wasn't just a habit, it was a survival skill passed down through experience. At the same time, Harlem was not lawless chaos. Order existed, but it was an alternative kind of order enforced through reputation, fear, and loyalty rather than official institutions. When conflicts arose, they were often handled quietly and quickly, long before authorities ever got involved. This created a sense that justice was selective and situational. Police presence in Harlem reflected this balance of power. Officers patrolled the area, but many understood the limits of their reach. There were places they went and places they avoided, conversations they pushed and others they let die. It wasn't always corruption in the obvious sense. It was accommodation, an understanding of how things worked. For residents, this atmosphere created constant tension. On one hand, there was pride in Harlem's independence and strength. On the other, there was fear of what could happen if you found yourself caught in the wrong situation. People learned to mind their business, even when something felt deeply wrong. This was the environment surrounding Ruby Williams' murder, a place where influence mattered more than innocence, and power could quietly redirect attention. Understanding Harlem under Bumpy Johnson's rule is essential. because it explains how a crime involving an 18-year-old girl could exist in plain sight, yet still slip into the shadows without open resistance. Bumpy Johnson's reputation was built long before Ruby Williams' name ever entered the conversation. To many in Harlem, he wasn't just a gangster, he was a force, someone whose name carried weight in every room, on every block. His presence alone was often enough to settle disputes, stop violence, or make problems disappear. People didn't need to see him to feel his influence. Knowing he might be involved was usually enough. What made Bumpy different from other crime figures was the way he balanced fear and respect. He was known to be ruthless when crossed. He also cultivated an image of fairness within his own rules. He helped people financially, supported local businesses, and positioned himself as someone who protected Harlem from outside exploitation. That dual image made him untouchable in the eyes of many. His influence extended well beyond the streets. Bumpy had connections to politicians, to lawyers, and, most importantly, to law enforcement. These weren't always formal relationships, but they were understood. Favors were exchanged. Lines were negotiated. There was a quiet agreement that certain boundaries wouldn't be crossed if peace was maintained. Police officers working Harlem knew exactly who Bumpy Johnson was. Some feared him. Others respected him. And a few benefited from the stability his control brought to the neighborhood. Dynamic created a dangerous gray area where enforcing the law became selective, shaped by who was involved rather than what had been done. Bumpy's reputation also discouraged resistance. Witnesses didn't just worry about retaliation, they worried about isolation. Speaking out against someone like him could mean being cut off from your community, your livelihood, or your safety. Silence was often the safer choice, even when it felt morally wrong. Importantly, Bumpy didn't need to directly threaten anyone to exert control. His past actions spoke for him. People remembered what happened to those who challenged his authority or disrespected his influence. That memory functioned as a warning, constantly reinforcing his power without a word being spoken. By the time Ruby Williams was murdered, Bumpy Johnson's reputation was already a shield. Not one that protected innocence, but one that protected order as he defined it. Understanding his influence explains why people hesitated, why police slowed down, and why the case would soon drift into dangerous silence once his name began circulating behind closed doors. The case threatened Harlem's balance of power because it risked pulling hidden structures into public view. Ruby Williams' murder wasn't just a violent act, it was a disruption. Any killing that drew outside attention, especially involving someone so young, had the potential to invite scrutiny from city officials, media, and law enforcement units beyond the neighborhood. Kind of attention endangered the quiet arrangements that kept things running smoothly. Harlem at the time functioned on an uneasy equilibrium. Power brokers maintained control, police maintained surface-level order. Most residents tried to live their lives without getting caught in between. A high-profile investigation could destabilize that balance, forcing people to talk, choose sides, or expose relationships that were never meant to be examined closely. There was also the risk of precedent. If Ruby's case was pursued aggressively, it could signal that no incident was off limits. Even crimes connected, directly or indirectly, to powerful figures would be investigated without restraint. Idea alone was dangerous to those who relied on predictability and controlled outcomes. For influential figures in Harlem, chaos was the real enemy. Disorder attracted outsiders, task forces, and federal interest. Even if no one intended to protect a murderer, protecting the system often took priority. A quiet case was safer than a loud one, even if it meant justice was never fully served. The threat wasn't only legal, it was social. Witnesses speaking openly could fracture trust within the community. Long-standing rules about silence and loyalty could be broken, leading to fear, retaliation, and instability. Once that door opened, it would be hard to close again. Police, too, had reasons to tread carefully. An investigation that went too far could strain relationships they depended on to keep the peace. In neighborhoods like Harlem, enforcement often relied on cooperation, formal or informal, with people who held real influence. Rocking that boat came with consequences. Context: Ruby Williams' murder became more than a single tragedy. It became a potential catalyst for exposure, disruption, and loss of control. And for those invested in maintaining Harlem's fragile balance of power, allowing the case to quietly fade may have seemed like the safest option, even if it came at a devastating human cost. The first 24 hours after Ruby Williams' murder were critical, and the way they unfolded would set the tone for everything that followed. In most homicide cases, this initial period is a whirlwind of activity, investigators canvassing neighborhoods, gathering evidence, and interviewing anyone who might have seen or heard something. With Ruby, however, the hours were filled with tension and restraint rather than urgency. From the start, there were reports of officers arriving at the scene, taking notes, and then leaving with little follow-up. Residents who might have been witnesses noticed the subdued presence and interpreted it as a warning rather than assistance. In a neighborhood like Harlem at the time, that quiet approach spoke volumes. Silence was often safer than exposure, especially when a figure like Bumpy Johnson could influence outcomes behind the scenes. During those first hours, rumors began to circulate. People speculated about what had happened, why Ruby had been targeted, and who might be responsible. Yet few spoke openly, and even fewer were willing to go to the authorities with what they knew. Fear, respect, and uncertainty created a vacuum where facts were scarce and speculation filled the void. By the end of the first day, family members and neighbors were left frustrated and anxious. Calls to law enforcement seemed to go unanswered, and official updates were minimal at best. In a normal situation, that frustration would have translated into pressure on the police to act. Instead, there was a noticeable pullback, a subtle but decisive slowing of momentum. Meanwhile, Bumpy Johnson was reportedly aware of the situation almost immediately. In a community where word traveled fast, it's believed that his network of contacts quickly assessed what needed to be done to maintain control. The first 24 hours weren't just about investigating a crime. They were about containing its consequences and ensuring that attention didn't spiral beyond what could be managed quietly. The psychological effect on the neighborhood was immediate. Witnesses understood the stakes speak out, and you risked retaliation, stay silent, and life continued with a shadow of unease. That tension reinforced the sense that the police weren't entirely in charge, and that the invisible hand of local power brokers had already begun to shape the narrative. By the close of that first day, the murder of Ruby Williams had already been transformed from a straightforward homicide into a story controlled by fear, influence, unspoken rules. What should have been a period of action and investigation instead became a moment of observation, calculation, quiet manipulation, a harbinger of the way the case would unfold over the following days. The moves Bumpy Johnson allegedly made behind the scenes after Ruby Williams' murder were calculated and deliberate, executed with the precision that had earned him his reputation. He didn't need to announce his presence or make threats openly. His influence worked quietly, shaping events before most people even realized what had happened. Within hours, those connected to him were reportedly already in motion, ensuring that certain conversations and investigations went in directions favorable to him. It's believed that Bumpy reached out to key contacts within the neighborhood, including local figures who might have witnessed or known details about the crime. The purpose was twofold: to control the narrative and to ensure that no one acted impulsively in a way that could attract unwanted attention. In a place like Harlem, a few strategic phone calls or visits could redirect curiosity, protect his interests, and maintain the balance of power. At the same time, there are accounts suggesting that he communicated with individuals who had influence over law enforcement, whether through direct relationships or indirect pressure. The effect was the same. Officers who might have pursued leads aggressively began to act more cautiously. The investigation, which could have moved swiftly in a normal circumstance, slowed almost immediately. Part of Bumpy's approach also involved the community itself. Rumors, warnings, and subtle signs were enough to ensure that witnesses were hesitant to come forward. The fear wasn't overt. There were no public threats. The memory of past consequences for crossing him was enough to keep people silent. In essence, Bumpy's presence loomed over the neighborhood without him needing to be physically present. His actions during those 3 days also had the effect of compartmentalizing information. People only knew what they were allowed to know, and any details that might expose him or disrupt his influence were quietly contained. By managing the flow of information, he ensured that the murder remained a controlled crisis rather than a public spectacle. Even as the investigation continued in fits and starts, the invisible hand of Bumpy Johnson ensured that momentum never reached a point where it could threaten his authority. Police inquiries, community chatter, and family questions were all subtly redirected or cooled. His moves were not about committing the crime itself, but about shaping the consequences in a way that protected him and maintained Harlem's fragile social equilibrium. By the end of those 3 days, the murder of Ruby Williams had been transformed from a straightforward investigation into a situation dominated by strategy, influence, and fear. The quiet power Bumpy wielded behind the scenes demonstrated that control could be as effective and sometimes more dangerous than violence in determining the outcome of a tragedy. Law enforcement's sudden change in behavior during Ruby Williams' case was subtle but unmistakable. In the first hours after her murder, police activity had been visible but restrained. Interviews were conducted, the scene was secured, and evidence collected. Yet, after Bumpy Johnson's influence reportedly began to take effect, the tone of the investigation shifted. What had seemed like routine procedure slowly became a lack of urgency, a measured response that frustrated those expecting action. Officers who had initially appeared attentive began to withdraw. Follow-up calls to witnesses were delayed or ignored, and lines of inquiry that might have led to suspects were left unexplored. Detectives who might have pursued aggressive leads instead focused on peripheral details, creating the appearance of work without the substance. For the community observing, it was clear that something or someone was guiding the pace of the investigation. This change wasn't necessarily the result of overt corruption in every instance. In many cases, it was the subtle effect of influence and fear. Bumpy Johnson's reputation preceded him, and many officers understood, either consciously or instinctively, that pushing too hard could upset the delicate balance of power in the neighborhood. Understanding shaped their decisions, often more effectively than direct instructions ever could. Witnesses noticed the shift as well. Those who might have been willing to talk initially sensed the reluctance of law enforcement to press certain angles. When police questions became less persistent or follow-ups less frequent, fear and uncertainty filled the vacuum. People interpreted the change as confirmation that speaking up could be dangerous or pointless. The perception of selective enforcement grew rapidly. Residents began to connect the dots. Some crimes were aggressively pursued, others quietly shelved. Ruby Williams' murder increasingly fell into the latter category. This selective attention sent a chilling message, reinforcing the sense that authority was negotiable, contingent on influence rather than facts. Even within the department, the shift in behavior was likely noticed by seasoned officers. Cases that might have otherwise gained traction were slowed or deprioritized. Internal frustration may have existed, but the social and political realities of Harlem at the time limited overt action. The consequences of ignoring those realities could be severe, creating an unspoken restraint on the investigation. By the end of those early days, law enforcement's sudden behavioral change had effectively reshaped the case. What should have been a rapid, determined pursuit of justice became a slow, constrained process, heavily influenced by the shadow of Bumpy Johnson. The result was a tragedy compounded. Not only was Ruby Williams murdered, the system that should have protected her allowed her case to drift into obscurity. Witnesses who might have come forward in Ruby Williams' case reportedly stopped talking, either out of fear, loyalty, or a sense that speaking up was pointless. In the immediate aftermath of her murder, neighbors and acquaintances had information, small details, observations, even suspicions, that could have helped build a case. Those individuals quickly realized that remaining silent was the safer, smarter choice. Fear was the most obvious factor. Bumpy Johnson's reputation for swift and uncompromising action against anyone who threatened his authority was well known in Harlem. Even those with no direct connection to him understood that crossing certain lines or even appearing to cooperate with law enforcement in sensitive matters could result in retaliation. Silence became a protective measure, a way to navigate a dangerous environment. Loyalty and community codes also played a role. Harlem operated on a system of unspoken rules, where outsiders, including law enforcement, were often treated with suspicion. Witnesses had learned from experience that talking too much to the police could backfire, leading to social isolation or being labeled a snitch. For many, it wasn't just fear of physical harm. It was the social consequences that kept them quiet. Some witnesses may have wanted to help, but felt powerless. Even when they tried to share information, the police's restrained response sent a clear signal that their efforts might not lead to action. When authority figures appear disinterested or constrained, community members can lose confidence that truth-telling will matter, further reinforcing silence. Psychologically, this created a self-reinforcing cycle. Fewer witnesses spoke, law enforcement encountered limited leads, and the case began to stagnate. People who might have come forward later saw that initial silence had no negative consequences for the influential parties involved, which only strengthened the perception that speaking out was risky or futile. The impact of witnesses stopping their cooperation went beyond the immediate investigation. It limited the evidence available, delayed potential breakthroughs, and shaped the narrative in ways favorable to those with influence. Without first-hand accounts, police and the community had fewer tools to challenge the control exerted behind the scenes. Ultimately, the quieting of witnesses ensured that the murder of Ruby Williams remained shrouded in mystery for far longer than it might have otherwise. Silence became part of the system that protected power, while the lack of testimony contributed to the perception that justice was negotiable, and that some lives, tragically, were easier to ignore than to defend. The way fear and influence replaced justice in Ruby Williams' case is a chilling example of how power can manipulate outcomes. From the moment she was murdered, the usual mechanisms designed to ensure accountability, police investigation, community reporting, witness testimony, were undermined not by incompetence alone, but by the presence of an unseen force shaping behavior. The result was that justice became secondary to control. Fear played a central role in this process. Residents and potential witnesses quickly recognized that stepping forward could carry serious consequences. The memory of past reprisals for speaking out against powerful figures like Bumpy Johnson created an atmosphere where silence was the safest option. People acted not out of malice, but out of survival instinct, prioritizing their own safety over pursuing justice for Ruby. Influence also dictated how the case unfolded. Bumpy Johnson's network of contacts, both formal and informal, was sufficient to redirect attention, slow investigations, and manage the flow of information. The result was that those responsible for enforcing the law operated under constraints, consciously or unconsciously, limited their effectiveness. Justice was no longer impartial. It was negotiable, contingent on influence rather than truth. Community dynamics amplified this effect. In neighborhoods where authority is exercised as much by social norms as by legal systems, the lines between right and safe behavior blur. Witnesses, neighbors, and even local officials learned to weigh loyalty, fear, consequences more heavily than ethics. Ruby's case was filtered through these informal but powerful social rules, which prioritized stability over justice. The police, intentionally or otherwise, became complicit in this replacement of justice with influence. By pulling back, avoiding aggressive questioning, allowing certain narratives to dominate, law enforcement effectively ceded control of the case to the forces shaping Harlem behind the scenes. Their lack of assertive action communicated to the community that some people were untouchable. As days passed, the combination of fear and influence created a chilling ripple effect. Witnesses stayed quiet, investigators treaded lightly, and rumors filled the gaps left by factual reporting. In this environment, truth became fragmented, accountability elusive, and the moral imperative of justice was quietly subordinated to the practical realities of power. In the end, Ruby Williams' murder illustrates a tragic intersection. When fear and influence override law, the pursuit of justice is stifled. The young woman's death was compounded by a system in which authority could be manipulated and silence enforced, leaving a stark reminder that, in some contexts, power, not righteousness, determines the outcome of a tragedy. Ruby Williams' case has endured as a painful symbol of systemic failure and the selective application of justice. What her murder represents today extends far beyond a single crime. It highlights how power, influence, and fear can shape the outcome of events in ways that leave ordinary people without protection. Her story is a stark reminder of the fragility of justice when human systems are manipulated. For historians and true crime researchers, Ruby's murder serves as an example of the broader social dynamics in Harlem during Bumpy Johnson's era. It shows how organized influence could quietly control narratives, manage investigations, and even dictate the behavior of law enforcement. Her case is frequently cited as a benchmark for understanding how communities governed themselves when outside oversight was limited or intentionally redirected. Ruby's age and vulnerability amplify the tragedy. An 18-year-old's life cut short carries a particular weight, and her youth makes the inaction around her murder all the more disturbing. Her story is not just about a crime. It's about the social and institutional conditions that allowed that crime to remain unresolved. It raises uncomfortable questions about whose lives are valued and whose are not. The cultural memory of her case has persisted in part because of its symbolic resonance. For generations, it has been a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked power and the limitations of law enforcement when confronted with fear, respect, or intimidation. Ruby Williams has come to represent countless individuals whose voices were muted by circumstance and influence. Her story also underscores the critical role of documentation and research in preserving truth. Because witnesses remained silent and records were limited, much of what we know comes from painstaking historical work, interviews, and cross-referencing of sparse records. The effort to reconstruct her story emphasizes the importance of keeping memory alive, especially for victims who might otherwise be forgotten. For the broader public, Ruby Williams' case challenges assumptions about justice and authority. It forces an acknowledgement that the legal system does not operate in isolation and that societal power dynamics, both visible and invisible, can profoundly affect outcomes. It also reminds us that understanding history requires examining the forces behind the headlines, not just the events themselves. Ultimately, Ruby Williams' murder represents more than a personal tragedy. It is a lens through which we can examine Harlem, power, and systemic inequities of the past. Her story endures as a powerful lesson on the dangers of influence overriding law and the human cost when justice is subordinated to fear and control. In remembering her, we confront the realities of power and the ongoing struggle to ensure that justice truly reaches everyone.